Growing up on Florida's East Coast, I thought I understood hurricanes. We rode out Francis and Jean in 2004, and while they were destructive, they felt almost routine. The preparations, the howling wind, the cleanup afterwards. It's just part of being a Floridian. But last October, huddled alone in a bathroom with my pets as Hurricane Milton tore through Florida, I learned what a storm could really do. Outside, a massive oak tree crashed through the house. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. When it was finally over, I walked through a changed landscape. Concrete peeled from buildings like paper, rebar bent outward like twisted fingers, high-rises torn open to the sky. It was the kind of devastation that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about nature's fury. And as I stood there, looking at the aftermath of Milton, I couldn't help but think about the really big ones. The storms that changed not just landscapes, but history itself. The ones that rewrote what we thought possible. Nothing exemplifies that more than what happened in the Florida Keys on Labor Day, 1935. Welcome to Mysteries of the Marsh, where we dive into the Sunshine State's strangest legends, untamed histories, and forgotten chapters. I'm Samantha, an 8th-generation Floridian with a passion for the stories that shaped our state. And few forces have shaped Florida more profoundly than our hurricanes. Labor Day weekend in 1935 brought the most intense hurricane to ever strike American soil. The storm became more than just a weather event. It became a tale of heroism and heartbreak, of government negligence and ghostly echoes that still haunt these islands today. So grab your bug spray and brace yourself. This storm is about to break. The Florida Keys lived and died by the railroad. The Florida East Coast Railway, completed in 1912 after 7 years of brutal labor and staggering costs, had reshaped these islands. Henry Flagler spent $50 million of his own fortune, nearly $1.4 billion in today's money, to build what many called Flagler's Folly. Over 4,000 men worked on its construction, and hundreds died in the process. They battled heat, disease, and hurricanes, but what they built was remarkable. 156 miles of track, including 23 miles of bridges over open water, connecting mainland Florida to Key West. But by 1935, multiple blows had transformed the Keys. First came the devastating 1926 hurricane, damaging sections of Flagler's railway. Then, the Great Depression struck. The grand hotels that once hosted Rockefellers and Vanderbilts now struggled to keep their lights on. Key West, once Florida's wealthiest city per capita, had declared bankruptcy in 1934. Over 80% of the local population was on federal relief. This crisis brought President Roosevelt's New Deal to the Keys. Under the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, about 700 World War I veterans were sent south. These men, many part of the Bonus Army, would convert the hurricane-damaged railway route into a modern highway, a last chance at steady work in desperate times. That summer, 3 federal work camps dotted Lower Matacombe Key. These weren't the primitive shanties common to many New Deal projects. They were organized facilities, each with its own administration, mess hall, and medical station. Camp number 1 on Windley Key housed 150 men. Camp number 3 near Lower Matacombe had 120 workers. Camp number 5, the largest, held 185 veterans. The men came from all over. Former bankers from New York, farmers from Georgia, mechanics from Chicago, all veterans of the Great War, all desperate for work. The camps provided structure. Reveille at 5:30 a.m., breakfast at 6. Work from 7 to 3:30 with an hour for lunch. 6 days a week, they earned their $1 a day converting the old railroad right-of-way into a modern highway. But the camp's conditions were harsh: stifling heat, limited sanitation, and little access to reliable transportation. In many ways, they were as isolated as the islands themselves. Life in the Keys followed its own rhythms. Local fishing boats headed out before dawn, returning to sell their catch to the fish houses that dotted the harbors. The railroad workers and camp veterans gathered at local spots like the Matacombe Club or the Island Murata Inn, where owner Pauline Pinder served fresh-caught snapper for 35 cents a plate. Communication with the mainland relied on a single telegraph line that ran alongside the railroad. Weather reports came twice daily by wire from the Weather Bureau in Jacksonville, though these focused more on conditions that might affect shipping than on threats to the islands themselves. Local knowledge, the way pelicans flew, the color of the sunset, the feel of the wind, often proved more reliable than official forecasts. The railroad remained the Keys' lifeline. 3 daily trains, 2 passenger, 1 freight, connected these islands to the mainland. The morning train left Key West at 8:15, passing through Matacombe around 10:30 on its way north. The afternoon train arrived from Miami at 2:15, and the evening freight made its run after sunset. Each train's whistle marked time for the islanders, as regular as the tides. This was the Florida Keys in 1935, a place caught between its glamorous past and uncertain future, where railroad tracks paralleled ancient fishing routes and where veterans of one American crisis came face to face with another. The islands themselves remained as they had for millennia, low-lying strips of coral and limestone, their highest points barely 15 feet above the sea, surrounded by some of the most unpredictable waters in the world. The Florida Keys hang like a necklace between 2 vast bodies of water, the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. This geography, which made the Keys such a vital maritime crossroads, also made them uniquely vulnerable. Florida's peninsula creates a natural funnel for storms, drawing them in from both east and west. The warm waters that make the Keys a fisherman's paradise also provide fuel for hurricanes, with surface temperatures often exceeding 84 degrees. By August 28th, a tropical wave had reached the southwestern Atlantic near the Bahamas. In 1935, predicting storms was more of an art than a science. No satellites tracked their movements, no hurricane hunters flew into their hearts. Weather forecasters in Washington and Miami relied entirely on ships' reports and scattered island stations, piecing together the storm's story from fragments of data. Those fragments told an increasingly worrying tale. Barometric pressure falling sharply, seas building from moderate to dangerous in hours. The system was intensifying faster than anyone expected, feeding off water temperatures that were unusually high even for the late summer. The storm was now moving west-northwest, steered by high pressure to the north. The warm waters of the Gulf Stream fed its strength. In just 24 hours, it would undergo one of the most dramatic intensifications ever recorded. But on that last day of August, as Labor Day weekend began, few in the Keys understood what was brewing offshore. With no modern radar or hurricane categories to guide them, forecasters severely underestimated what was coming. They raised storm warnings along the Keys, expecting perhaps a Category 1 or 2 hurricane. Nothing like what was actually approaching. By September 1st, some locals began noticing nature's warning signs. Fishermen spoke of unusual skies, animals behaved strangely. A few experienced islanders, reading these ancient signals, took their boats and fled. Zora Neale Hurston would later write, "There is something about the dead calm that precedes hurricanes. It is ominous, foreboding, waiting. It is the atmosphere of the miscarriage of natural things." As conditions worsened, more residents desperately sought escape. It wasn't until 4:25 p.m. on September 2nd that a rescue train was finally dispatched from Miami. The Florida East Coast Railway sent a locomotive with several passenger cars and an empty boxcar, hoping to evacuate the veterans and other residents. But the train's progress was agonizingly slow, forced to stop repeatedly as debris and strengthening winds battered the tracks. By the time it reached Island Murata around 8 p.m., hurricane-force winds were already howling across the Keys. Labor Day, 1935. The storm's approach had become unmistakable. At her store in Upper Matacombe Key, Etta Parker Sweeting watched as the wind began peeling paper from her roof. Her barometer was dropping rapidly, a classic warning sign that something far worse than a typical storm was approaching. 6-year-old Everett Albury and his family could see it too. Nobody knew, he would later recall. That was the scary part of the whole thing. They watched helplessly as the wind grew stronger and the water began to rise. The railroad embankment that had always seemed so solid, so permanent, a barrier between them and the angry sea, would soon become their only hope for survival. Only 20 to 30 men had managed to board the rescue train before catastrophe struck. At 8:20 p.m., an 18-foot storm surge slammed into the train, tearing the passenger cars and boxcar from the tracks. The massive wave lifted the heavy rail cars like toys, washing some out to sea entirely. The train crew survived only by clinging desperately to their locomotive as the water rose around them. In Camp 5 on Lower Matacombe, the veterans faced impossible choices. As their barracks began to splinter, some sought refuge in the only concrete structure they could find, the cesspool beneath a 3-seater outhouse. The tank stood 5 feet high, with a drain leading to the ocean. They packed it with coats and blankets, trying to keep the water out. Others clung to a tank car on the railroad tracks. The storm proved stronger than any shelter. A massive wave forced its way through the cesspool drain, flooding the concrete tank. As the men emerged, some were immediately blown away by the ferocious winds. Paul Pugh, top sergeant of Camp 1 on Winley Key, described their experience. On Winley Key, about 70 men hung on to the water tank car on the railway. It was hell to just hang on and not be able to do anything. When in France, we had something to fight against. Down here, we just had to wait for death and do nothing. The scene repeated across all 3 camps. Wooden buildings shattering, tents shredding, men fighting for any handhold against the storm's fury. By nightfall, the barometer plunged to 892 millibars, the lowest ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Winds screamed at 185 miles per hour, driving a storm surge of more than 18 feet across the low-lying islands. 16-year-old Lorette Pender Russell huddled with her family as the storm raged around them. "It was a very hard night," she would later say, her voice still shaking at the memory decades later, "and it's something that if you ever experience, you will never forget." The storm's peak lasted for hours, though to those living through it, time seemed to lose all meaning. In the darkness, there was only the roar of the wind, the crash of waves, and the sounds of the keys being torn apart. Dawn revealed a changed world. Where the veterans' camps had stood, only scattered debris remained. Of the 185 men at Camp 5, just 12 survived. The Overseas Railroad, Flagler's engineering marvel that had transformed the Keys, lay in ruins, its tracks twisted like copper wire, its bridges shattered. Ernest Hemingway arrived from Key West to help with recovery efforts. What he found moved him to rage. The town of Matacombe, he wrote, is nothing but a thin line of broken matchsticks on the horizon. But it was the fate of the veterans that haunted him most. The survivors he met were rattled as a snake-bitten horse, their nerves shot to pieces in a way that reminded him of the men fresh from the trenches of the Great War. Hemingway's pen turned to fury as he wrote, "Who murdered the vets?" for the New Masses magazine. Who sent them down to the Florida Keys and left them there in hurricane months, he demanded. His article condemned the government's negligence, pointing out that the camps had no evacuation plan, no transportation, and no real chance of escape. The official death toll would eventually reach 408, though some accounts suggest the true number was higher. Many bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or buried in the mangrove swamps. Others were found miles from where they died, carried inland by the storm surge. In Island Murata, workers built a mass grave, stacking the bodies between layers of quicklime. The memorial that stands there today contains the cremated remains of nearly 300 victims. Its inscription reads simply, "Dedicated to the memory of the civilians and war veterans whose lives were lost in the hurricane of September 2nd, 1935. The hurricane marked the end of an era. The Florida East Coast Railway, facing massive repair costs during the Great Depression, abandoned its overseas railroad. The tracks would later become the foundation for the Overseas Highway, fulfilling the veterans' construction mission in a way no one could have foreseen. But for those who survived, the memories of that night never faded. The impossible wind, the relentless surge, the haunting silence that followed. It all lived on in stories passed down through generations of Keys families. These tales, retold in quiet voices at fish houses and around campfires, became the threads of a shared trauma woven into the island's identity. When reports emerged that the government had ignored warnings and delayed evacuation, public outrage swept through the Keys. For years after, the twisted wreckage of the rescue train remained where the storm had hurled it, a rusting reminder of that fatal negligence. And some say that even today, on stormy nights, echoes of that tragedy remain. In the quiet stretches of the old highway, locals claim to hear the faint whistle of a phantom train. The ghost train of the Overseas Railroad is said to retrace its doomed path, its wheels rumbling through the mangroves, its headlights cutting through the darkness before vanishing into the mist. Some say they can hear the screech of metal as phantom passenger cars and boxcars are once again torn from their tracks by an invisible surge. The splash as they're washed out to sea. Then there are the soldiers. Many of the veterans who perished were never properly buried, their remains lost to the storm surge or burned in mass graves. Stories abound of shadowy figures seen near the old work camps, men in tattered uniforms gazing towards the horizon as if waiting for a rescue train that will never arrive. In Lower Matacombe Key, a more persistent tale haunts the remains of Camp 5. In the years following the hurricane, survivors and workers in the area began reporting a peculiar sight. A solitary figure in tattered work clothes, the kinds the veterans wore, walking along what remained of the railway tracks. He clutches a rusted toolbox, as if still trying to complete his work before the storm. Those who've encountered this spectral worker describe an unsettling scene. Sometimes he vanishes when approached, leaving behind only the phantom sound of tools clanking in the darkness and a strange mixture of scents, salt water and burning wood, an eerie echo of the mass cremations that followed the disaster. Other times, he's seen gesturing skyward with an anguished look before disappearing in a flash of lightning. Even today, travelers along U.S. Highway 1, built upon the old rail route, report glimpses of this shadowy figure along the roadside at night. Locals speak of inexplicable cold spots near where Camp 5 once stood, even on the most sweltering Florida nights. Some believe he's searching for his fellow workers, their bodies never recovered from the storm. Others see him as a reminder of the government's failure to protect these veterans, his unfinished work as a symbol of all the lives cut short at Labor Day. But the legacy of the 1935 Labor Day hurricane goes beyond ghost stories. It was a turning point that reshaped how we think about hurricanes and their devastating power. At the time, storm forecasting was rudimentary at best. Warnings were sparse, and communication relied on fragile telegraph lines that were no match for the storm's fury. This hurricane became a wake-up call. Its destruction and the tragic loss of life demanded change. In the years that followed, the U.S. Weather Bureau began issuing standardized hurricane warnings aimed not just at shipping lanes, but also at vulnerable coastal communities. The tragedy spurred advancements in meteorology, including the use of aircraft reconnaissance and, eventually, satellite imagery. Public education campaigns about hurricane preparedness became a priority, transforming how people braced for these deadly storms. The storm also left a physical legacy. The Overseas Highway, completed in 1938, rose from the ruins of the railroad. It connected the islands in ways that Flagler's train never could, bringing tourism, commerce, and a new chapter in the Keys' history. Today, visitors driving along the Overseas Highway might not realize they're traveling a road built on the bones of history. Yet, the scars remain if you know where to look. The Veterans Memorial in Islamorada, the scattered ruins of Flagler's railroad, and the whispered stories passed down through generations. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane isn't just a tale of destruction. It's a story of survival, resilience, and the haunting echoes of a storm that Florida will never forget. Standing in Milton's aftermath last October, I found myself thinking about Etta Parker Sweeting, watching paper peel from her roof, about 6-year-old Everett Albury as the waters rose, about those veterans clinging to hope as the rescue train arrived too late. Every generation of Floridians has their storm, their moment when nature reminds us of our place in this wild state. But we rebuild, we remember, and we pass these stories down, not just as warnings, but as a testament to the strength of those who weathered these storms before us. Want to dive deeper into Florida's untamed past? Follow us on Instagram at Mysteries of the Marsh for historical photos, newspaper clippings, and other artifacts from each episode. You'll get a behind-the-scenes look at the real people and places we discuss, plus updates on new episodes dropping every Saturday. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizons, and don't feed the gators.